This is an interview of Gloria McCauley conducted on December 4th of 2008 at about 1:45 p.m. at the Buckeye Region Anti-Violence Organization.
I'm Gloria McCauley, Caucasian, 56 years old, born July 11, 1952.
All right, excellent. Well, tell me about your family.
Well, that one's kind of weird. You mean my family of origin? Like birth family, etc.
Yeah.
Growing up?
Yeah, anything you'd like to talk about.
Okay. Well, I grew up in New York City. My mom was a single parent. It was myself and my sister and my mom. And I actually wasn't raised by my mom until I was almost a teenager. Mm-hmm. She was very poor, and so we were in boarding school, in a convent boarding school, until I was about 11 years old.
In New York?
Yeah, in upstate New York.
Mm-hmm.
Well, sort of upstate, just north of New York City.
What was the boarding school like?
Well, it was kind of weird, but I thought it was just normal. Mm-hmm. I had in hindsight, I had a kind of a reverse view of class issues, because I thought rich kids got to live at home, and that poor kids went away to school.
Did it bother you that you were there, or did you kind of like it?
No, I mean, it was normal. Mm-hmm. I mean,
yeah.
I mean, I was actually in boarding school by the time I was 18 months old. Oh. So, to me, that was just what my life was like. Uh-huh. It wasn't a matter of being good, bad, or indifferent. It was just what we did.
What you did.
Yeah.
Good. So, could you tell me a little bit about your siblings?
I have one sister. We were very close in age, actually born the same day, a year apart.
Oh.
So it was as close to being a twin as you could be and not be a twin. Uh-huh. Although we were pretty different kinds of people. She was a heck of a lot more outgoing. I was the kind of kid who would always disappear with a book. Mm-hmm. And especially at a young age, I would just always be off somewhere. Nobody ever knew where I was. I was just like sitting in a corner reading or observing.
Do you have an earliest memory from the boarding school?
Oh gosh, yeah, getting in trouble all the time.
Was that pretty common?
For me? Very absolutely, absolutely. Me and my sister actually. They had to separate us because we were just raising hell all the time.
Really?
Well, we were both younger than the norm going into the school. Mm-hmm. I mean, I was barely out of diapers. Yeah. And I was there 2 years before I even started kindergarten, and then because I was so young, I ended up spending 2 years in kindergarten. Mm-hmm. So, my entire, toddlerhood was spent there. So that was my home. Uh-huh.
Sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Was there any kind of a religious affiliation?
Oh, yeah, it was very Catholic.
Very Catholic.
Very Catholic.
Good.
It was a convent. Literally, it was a convent.
A convent.
Yeah.
Are you religious now, or?
No.
No?
No, I think I developed religious Teflon by the time I was about 3 years old.
Yeah.
And it just... I remember thinking, we had to go to church every morning.
Yeah. And
I remember being very, very young and thinking, well, this doesn't apply to me.
That's funny. How old would you say you were when you first realized that you were a lesbian?
Oh, gosh. I was, again, not looking at hindsight, but... because of my upbringing, I never even heard the word lesbian in a complete sentence until I was 22, 23 years old, married and pregnant with my first kid. And, I knew the word existed, but it had no reality for me. it was at that point I actually met a woman. My ex-husband introduced me to her, and they were co-workers. And
were you divorced from your husband at the time that he introduced you to her? Or
no. We had actually just gotten married.
Oh, okay.
And it was almost like a V8 moment, Oh my God, I could have been a lesbian. But it was actually about 3 or 4 or 5 years later that I came out. Because, I was an academic at heart, so I researched it.
Yeah.
And made all my friends crazy, asking them, doing surveys. What's the difference between a lesbian relationship and a heterosexual relationship? Do you fight less? Who cleans the litter tray?
Do you remember who the first person you told was?
Besides myself? No, I really don't, because by the time I actually came out, I was, my social group was primarily lesbian feminist.
Mm-hmm.
So, within that context, it was more that virtually everyone I knew said, well, it's about fucking time.
So I guess that was probably a pretty good atmosphere to have come out to.
Well, I had been politically active from the time I was a teenager, when I still lived in New York. And mostly I grew up in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and so I was a little hippie, and was very involved in the anti-war movement in the 60s, and in the second wave feminist movement. Although I didn't even know the word feminism until the mid 70s, so I always said I must have been an instinctual feminist. And when I started educating myself around feminism, it so totally made sense to me because it was already stuff I had theorized on my own.
Right. That's great.
So the people I chose to surround myself with were also, fairly politically active.
Right.
And the women's community here in Columbus in the 70s, late 70s, early 80s, was incredibly active. So it was a pretty large lesbian feminist community here in Columbus.
Mm-hmm. That's great. You said that was, what year would you have been coming out?
Let's see. As a parent, I always tell time by my kids' ages. So my older daughter was about 3, so it was 78.
78?
Yeah.
And how did your family react?
Well, that never was very important to me. My mom is one of those people who just doesn't want to hear anything. And remember the very Catholic upbringing. My mother was raised Catholic.
I understand. I have a Catholic family.
And she is now 85 years old, and just about 5 years ago was able to say the word lesbian for the first time. The whole time I grew up, her code word for lesbian was, she should have been a nun. So it was more it was something that my mom was never very comfortable discussing. And she was fine as long as I didn't bring it up overtly. My partner and I have been together 27 years, so she had no choice but to either, get over it or get under it and push, because I'm not going to change.
Does she get along well with your partner?
Oh, yeah.
Does?
Yeah.
That's good.
Actually, sometimes they get along better than I get along with my mother.
So it's fine at family gatherings. It's not tense.
Well, it's a really small family. I'm the only surviving kid. My stepfather died a few years ago, so, it's just us.
Right.
And our 2 kids, so...
How did your ex-husband react?
Well, he threatened to sue for custody.
Wonderful.
Oh yeah. Well, and in the 70s, he would have won. One of my ex-partners, her daughter was a couple of years younger than my older daughter, and I watched it happen. The child's father took the child and disappeared for 5 years with her. Got custody and then ignored the visitation and co-custody agreements and left the state with the kid. And there was nothing she could do. It took us 5 years to find that kid.
Well, you did find the kid?
We did.
How did you do that?
Well, again, remembering the political activism and the mindset in the 70s, early 80s, in the lesbian feminist community was we had to rely on ourselves. And certainly could not count on the court systems to bring justice. So my partner and I and my ex, whose daughter was the one taken, every Tuesday night we would drive out to David's parents' house, who lived way out on the east side.
David
the father.
Is the father. Okay.
Yeah. And we would drive out and go to the alley behind their house and steal their garbage. And then we would bring it home and spread it out on a tarp in our living room and go through it piece by piece, looking for bills, telephone bills, any kind of correspondence. And that's how we finally found him in Florida.
That's incredible. Yeah. That's pretty impressive.
Yeah, it felt pretty good.
Yeah.
It was a disgusting job.
I bet. But that's pretty impressive.
It's having a shredder is really important to me now because of that experience.
Because of that.
Yeah.
That makes sense. How did you end up telling your kids?
I didn't have to. I mean, they've known it from day one. Actually, my older daughter, she was probably about 6 years old when she asked me. We were driving up to the Michigan Women's Music Festival, and thankfully I wasn't driving, but she was in the back seat, and she said, "Mom, are you a lesbian?" And I just turned around and said, "Yes." She said, "Oh, okay."
Well, that's great.
And then about 5 minutes later, I said, "Do you know what the word discretion means?" She said, "Oh yeah, don't tell Dad." Yeah, that's it.
Smart girl.
Yes, she is.
So you said you were already heavily involved with the feminist movement, so you probably already knew a lot of people that had come out, or was it?
Well, yeah, I did. And I mean, for a couple of years, I spent quite a bit of time just immersing myself in feminist culture, and for me, that also meant an introduction to lesbian culture. And I think the first political thing that I did here in Columbus was I went to the first Take Back the Night rally at OSU. Oh no, there was something earlier than that. There was this National Organization for Women did this like National Day of Protest. Gosh, this must have been like 1977. It was called Alice Doesn't Live Here Anymore.
Were you saying that was the first one?
That I went to.
The first major.
Here in Columbus. That was specifically feminist. And they had a rally, I'm trying to remember, I think it was on campus. And it might have actually even been 1976. Because my daughter was pretty young. And anyway, the whole theme of the day was, not going into work and, trying to show the country what a financial impact women could have.
Yeah.
And so that evening there was a series of workshops and then a women's dance on campus. And I went there and I saw a whole bunch of people that I peripherally knew. And then I also ran into Julie, who was the woman who was a lesbian that my ex-husband had introduced me to. And I was like, hey, I remember you. Well, and actually she was my first girlfriend 5 years later.
So after that, would you say you were just kind of inspired to keep going with the activism? And
absolutely. Absolutely. Particularly around things like injustice. Mm-hmm. It just pisses me off.
Yeah.
And some really like personal things that happened that really pissed me off. And this is why I was saying, instinctual feminist. When my ex-husband and I got married, I didn't change my name. Which was quite a struggle in 1974. Mm-hmm. When my daughter was born, the hospital wouldn't release her to me because my name, the state law at the time stated that if you were married, any child you had to have the father's last name. And because my name was different than hers, they would not release her to me.
Oh, wow.
They wanted me to sign Mrs. Bruce Wentworth. And I said, well, I can't. That's not my name.
Yeah.
I had to call him and say, get your ass down here and sign this paper. And then the other thing that happened was we went to rent an apartment. Actually, it was University Village over on Olentangy River Road.
Yeah.
And the rental agent wanted double deposits because our names were different. And I told him no. He said, that's illegal. Mm-hmm. Why would you do that?
Yeah.
And he said, well, I don't believe you're married. Your name can't be different if you're married.
No.
So I said, okay, hold on. I'll be back in 45 minutes. And I went home and I got the marriage certificate and brought it in. And I said, where on there does it say I've changed my name? And I actually contacted, in those days, there was an organization out of Chicago called the Center for a Woman's Own Name. Mm-hmm. And it was helping with legal issues around that women were encountering by trying to buck the trend of, having to change your name. And I contacted them, and they gave me some legal support to put pressure on this rental company.
Wow!
So I didn't have to pay that.
Yeah, that's great.
So, activism felt good, because you actually, it was almost like instant gratification.
Yeah.
It worked.
And I understand that. When you first became involved with the community here, when you first came out, where did everybody kind of hang out to meet each other?
Well, actually, in the bars.
Mm-hmm.
And there were actually, two sets of places, primarily Jack's. Well, back in those days it was known as Jack's A Go-Go in the 60s. And then it was named Logan's Off Broadway. And then it was, went through about 5 names, but anybody who is now over the age of 40, just for all that time, just always called it Jack's. And you had to know that it went through those name changes if you wanted to look the phone number up in a phone book, because it was never listed as Jack's. You always had to look under Logan's Off Broadway. So that was one place. And in those days, the women's bars and the men's bars were very segregated. Jack's had a big sign outside that said, ladies' night, $10 cover for men. And there were men's bars that had a dress code for women. You could not come in there unless you were wearing a dress.
Oh, really?
Oh, they wanted to keep the women out.
Yes, that makes sense.
Which, we respected because we wanted to keep the men out of the women's bars. It was 2 very separate communities in those days.
Yeah.
The other place that women hung out was at a recovery place called WOW, Women's Outreach for Women. Lots of very politically active folk were involved in that group. So, it was a weird juxtaposition. The other place that people hung out was the softball fields. Columbus has for 30 years now had a very strong queer sports industry.
Mm-hmm.
We have not one, but two of the largest gay bowling leagues here in Columbus.
Nice.
Yeah.
So as far as you were saying, the gay men and the lesbians were very separate.
Mm-hmm.
Do you feel racially like it was kind of segregated too, or did everybody
Absolutely, and it still really is.
Yeah.
That's a barrier that I don't see that our community has been very successful at changing.
Mm-hmm. Do you think it's gotten a little better, or is it kind of almost exactly the same?
Racially, people, give it lip service, but I don't really see that as a community we've done a whole lot to broaden our horizons. And, people make excuses all the time of why our community appears to be so white, so middle class. And it's because that's where, the financial strength might come from. And we have never made the community comfortable for anyone who doesn't fit that demographic.
Uh-huh. What do you think that people could do to fix that?
Change their own attitudes and examine their own racism.
Uh-huh. How would you say transsexual people, how does that work within the community? Because I know a lot of times they're excluded.
It's really a misnomer when we say the community. There are so many communities.
Uh-huh.
So it really depends which aspect of the community we're talking about.
Yeah.
For many years, transgender folks were pretty much invisible in the community, or were not really incorporated within the community. It's only been the last 10 years that the T has been added onto GLBT.
Mm-hmm.
When I first started with political activism within the queer community, it was the gay rights movement. Lesbian wasn't in there. And we had to fight a long time to get the L in there, and then the B. And finally, about 10 years ago, it was the T was added. So, the trans community, I often tell people that I perceive the trans community as being a social movement that is probably about where the women's rights movement or the second wave of feminism was in the late 60s, in that early formation period where they're still choosing what to call themselves.
Yeah.
And it's an important part of social movement organization to have that space to do that.
Well, would you say, going back to kind of the social aspects, do you feel like the dating scene has kind of changed a lot, or is it...
I tell you what, I wouldn't know. Like I said, my partner and I have been together 27 years, and it's probably a damn good thing, because I was never very good at dating, even, 30 years ago. But from what I see and from what I hear from friends, so much of it has changed as far as how you meet people. So many more people are meeting in chat rooms and online. But I think quite often people are still meeting in the bars. People are still meeting at, queer events. So, I'm not sure how much that has changed. And I'm not sure that the interpersonal relationships of dating has changed very much.
Yeah, I wouldn't think so. Where were you working when you first came out?
I was working for Children's Hospital in the preemie ward, and then I was doing home health care. And then I went back to school.
Where did you go to school?
Oh, OSU.
OSU?
Yes.
What were you studying?
Women's Studies, of course. Undergrad and graduate.
Nice. Did you do undergrad here as well?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Were you out at the hospital?
No, I don't believe so. It was never very relevant.
Yeah, right.
I was working with infants.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they don't ask questions.
Hey, by the way,
did you know of anybody else that was out at work, or was it pretty much nobody?
Yeah, actually I
cared?
did. I mean, there was a group of us that would, we just somehow just gravitated towards each other and would eat, eat dinner together while we were at work.
Mm-hmm. Have you had jobs since then where you felt comfortable or uncomfortable? Or
every job I've had since then has been, I'm gay for pay.
Yeah, that's funny.
No, I pretty much made a conscious decision since 1989 to find employment being queer.
Yeah, well, that's a good idea. So what would you say motivated you in the first place to become involved with politics, even before you got here?
Well, I think it goes back to that justice gene.
The naming.
Yeah.
And all that.
Well, even before that, the civil rights movement of the 60s and the anti-war movement of the 60s. As a 16-year-old, I went and did civil disobedience training. Mm-hmm. And, growing up in New York City in the 60s, there was a protest or a riot virtually every other day.
But what is civil disobedience training? What's that like?
Civil disobedience is I
know what civil disobedience is. I'm saying, mm-hmm. How do they train you?
Most people don't really understand the concepts of civil disobedience and how to react when you're taking an action and the police come in. You're going to be arrested. You need to make plans before that. Mm-hmm. Civil disobedience, to be done effectively, needs to be highly organized. And, it's hilarious when my older daughter was 15 maybe, was during the first Gulf War with Daddy Bush. And the first bombs that they were setting off, the first wave of that Gulf War, there was an anti-war protest at OSU. Gosh, it must have been like 89 or 90. Mm-hmm. And so my partner and I and my older daughter, who was 14, 15 at the time, we were going to this anti-war rally and protest. And so we're about to leave our house, and I stopped my daughter at the front door, and I said, wait a minute, got a checklist. I said, you have ID? You have a phone number to call? You have a bandana in case there's tear gas? Do you have, and I went through this whole checklist. Yeah. And she looked at me, yes, Mom, yes, Mom, yes, Mom. And then I looked at her and I said, other mothers teach their daughters how to put on makeup.
Yes, that is far cooler. Did you have any political heroes or people that you kind of admired or looked up to?
No, I don't know that it was individuals. It was more conceptual. Mm-hmm. My favorite icon is the Walking Liberty, like on the Walking Liberty $50. So it's more ideological than attributed to like one person. I was thrilled when Geraldine Ferraro first made her bid for vice presidency. Mm-hmm. And I thought it was ironic that her birthday was the same as Susan B. Anthony's birthday, which is also Women's Suffrage Day, which is also my partner's birthday, which is how I remember her birthday. I think it was more how individual women fit the ideology that I was developing for myself rather than forming the ideology based on people.
Yeah, makes sense. Have your kids gotten involved with activism with you, or is it just every now and then they go?
Well, yeah, they kind of have. And as my partner and I look at each other sometimes and say, we taught them to be activists. We never said we could pick their issues. The younger one, who is 16 now, she does activism in her own way, and usually for her it's something that's a very personal issue.
Mm-hmm.
But, she hangs out with queer youth, so, they're learning activism in a different way than we learned it.
Yeah.
So,
did your kids ever get any, would people harass them at school based on them having a lesbian mom?
Possibly and probably, but neither one of them would take it.
Yeah.
I mean, they both grew up, kind of like me being in boarding school. That was just normal family for them.
Yeah.
So, it's like, what's your point?
Yeah. Did they go to school here in Columbus?
Mm-hmm.
Was it public or Catholic? Public school. As far as politics, can you remember there being any openly gay politicians that were kind of representing?
No, absolutely not, especially not here in Ohio.
Yeah.
Harvey Milk, it really, I think, hit, particularly those of us who were involved in queer politics at the time, it really hit us hard when he was murdered. Because, he had become this icon of, being the first openly gay elected official that, to a pretty high office.
Yeah.
And so a lot of people were familiar with the name and familiar with what he was trying to do. But prior to that, no. Mm. It was an immediate, if somebody was outed, there's no way, especially here in Ohio, no way that either party would back them for election. Mm. We were losing custody of our kids. Who's going to...
Yeah. They're not going to let you have your own kids.
Mm-hmm.
That'd be... Are people in Columbus as a whole, would you feel accepting of you? Like, do you feel comfortable going anywhere in Columbus?
I do.
As yourself? You do?
Yeah. I have a fair amount of assertiveness.
Yeah.
And maybe it comes from years of taking and teaching self-defense classes. I'm pretty aware of people's reactions on a nonverbal level, and I don't necessarily worry about it.
Yeah, that's good. The overall feeling of Ohio State versus when you were at grad school and doing undergrad, do you feel like the atmosphere changed in a positive way over those years, or is it kind of...
Well, when I was an undergraduate, there weren't all that many of us who were out. Mm-hmm. And so the 4 years as an undergrad, I was the lesbian in women's studies, Oh, we need to know what lesbians think. Go ask Gloria. And similarly, in grad school, and actually the reason I decided not to continue, because I had thought I was just going to continue and stay in academia, was that I was told that my activism was a barrier to academia. Well, I thought that was a little ironic for women's studies.
Yeah. Women's Studies Department told you that?
Yeah. Yes,
nice.
That because of my activism was my academic Achilles heel. And because of my activism, they doubted whether I would ever generate or understand high theory.
That's interesting. I feel like women's studies classes now, a lot of what you go over is activism.
Well, and my feeling is that they were giving it lip service, but they certainly didn't want me being an activist. Mm-hmm. While I was in grad school, I was also coordinating the Take Back the Night events in Columbus and coordinating security for Gay Pride. And so I was pretty visible.
Right. Well, were there any kind of organizations, maybe not political, but social groups for GLBT kids?
Kids, no.
Or students, I guess.
Students, yeah, sure, there always was. Way back in the mid-'70s, there was the Gay Liberation Front at OSU. Stonewall, back in the 70s, was called Stonewall Union, was a pretty important rallying for not necessarily the campus community, but for the rest of the city. Just the fact that we had an organization that was openly queer, published a monthly newspaper, had an office, sponsored events, sponsored Gay Pride March every year. That was a pretty important step in gaining some cohesion in the community, giving the community a voice.
Yeah, that's good. So a lot of Ohio State kids would come to Stonewall, or
not necessarily. A chronic problem, no matter where you are, is when you have a university or a college and a city. It's like actually having two cities.
Mm-hmm.
There's that imaginary moat around the university, and students and faculty often forget that there's another city outside, and the city forgets that there's another city inside.
Yeah.
So communication is very difficult. And the other piece of it is that you have a transient community at a college. Every 4 years, in theory, you have a totally new population. So the students tend to build their own structures as far as social groups and rely on university kinds of resources rather than stepping across that moat. It's very difficult to, like doing bias crimes and hate crimes reports. We get very few of them from students because they forget that we're out here.
Yeah. No, I totally understand that. What was it about Columbus that after you got out of school, instead of, speaking of transient communities, that you didn't leave yourself? What about Columbus made you want to stay?
It's comfortable here. Mm-hmm. And although, I lived here, I came here in 1973. And I lived here for about 18 years before I considered myself actually a resident of Columbus. Mm-hmm. When I realized that I owned a house and both my kids had grown up here, I guess I'm not just visiting anymore. Because I actually came here to visit somebody and never left. Mm-hmm. But, I like the city. It's very comfortable. I call it a sinkhole. You get here, it's comfortable. You don't really need to leave.
You don't need to. So you said you came here to visit somebody and then decided to go up to school up here?
Oh, no.
What?
Those events were years
apart?
Years apart. I didn't go back to school. I was a non-traditional student. Mm-hmm. I didn't go back to school until 1984. And I'd been here since 1973.
Oh, okay.
So
1973 you came to visit somebody.
Yeah, and stayed. I was living in Atlanta and traveling around and wrecked my car in Ann Arbor. Came here to visit. I said, I guess I'm staying.
Yeah. Were you visiting a friend or a family or something?
Friend.
A friend?
Mm-hmm.
And you liked it better than Atlanta?
Well, I hadn't been in Atlanta all that long.
Yeah.
And so I didn't have all that many ties there. I knew a few people, but there was nothing really to hold me there.
What motivated you to start Bravo? And how recently was that?
Well, actually, I worked at Stonewall in 1990. Stonewall got a small grant from Ohio Department of Health to design a program on hate crimes, specifically looking at sexual assault issues. But they didn't have, and they got the grant, and it was a small grant of like $15,000. and they didn't have anyone to design the program. Somebody wrote the grant. They got the grant. The person who wrote the grant had moved out of town, and because it was around issues of violence, and because I was already, I had been coordinating Take Back the Night for almost 10 years, and coordinating security for Pride for 10 years. The board president asked if I would temporarily come and work and design this project. I said sure, so I contracted for 3 months and stayed there for 6 years. But it was a really small program, really small project, and after about 6 years we realized that the anti-violence work needed to be separated out into a separate organization, just so that we could really focus it. And so that's what we did in 96.
It's been going ever since?
Yeah.
It's growing, would you say?
Yeah, in a very measured way. This past June was the 12th anniversary of Bravo, and that's when we announced that we were doing statewide expansion. So, very measured steps.
You do statewide? Where else?
We're focusing right now on the 3 Cs, Cincinnati, Cleveland, and Columbus, and we're just in the beginning phases of it. But, for years we've been going everywhere around the state doing trainings and technical assistance, particularly with sexual assault and domestic violence work. Gary goes to virtually every DV shelter there is to do trainings for them.
That's good.
So we've always done work around the state, but now we're doing a concerted effort to provide services because nobody else in the state is doing it.
Where exactly are you guys in Cincinnati? Do you have an office there? Or do
No.
Okay.
No.
I didn't notice that. I'm from Cincinnati, actually.
Are you?
Yeah, we have.
I'm going to be there again next week.
Really? For what?
For Bravo.
For Bravo.
We're having an event on Sunday. We just got a small grant from National City Bank to do outreach in Cincinnati. And so we're just going to have this shishi brunch event down there to publicize it.
What would you say? Would you say Bravo's maybe the crowning achievement of your activism, or what are you?
No, I'm not tired of it yet.
Yeah.
I still enjoy what I do. No, it's pretty much a work in progress, and it's pretty fun because it has taken on a life of its own. It's no longer dependent upon me. Somebody else could step into the role of ED, and it would continue on. So
that's good.
Yeah.
Nice. What are you most proud of, as far as your activism and your life's work?
Maybe just that I've been able to continue being an activist. I've seen so many people who are very active for a couple of years, and then they get into a relationship and they do that nesting thing and they disappear. And they might still care deeply about issues, but it becomes much more of a checkbook activist. Or they feel like, oh, we have kids now, we can't be so public about what we're doing. And so, I'm really appreciative of the fact that I've had the privilege of being able to be open about, being an activist, and, I don't have to hide it from anybody. I don't have to worry. I own my own house. I'm certainly out to my family.
Got a nice job.
Yeah, I get paid to be queer. I'm not going to get fired for it. And I think what makes me most proud is when I talk with folks that we've been able to help. That tells me that we're doing the right stuff.
Does that happen often?
Yeah. Well, we took over 200 hate and bias reports last year and approximately 50 DV reports. That's an awful lot of people that we're able to help. So.
Yeah. Well, that's great.
It means we're doing something right.
So what would you say the biggest difference between when you first came out and today? What is the biggest difference in, the community?
Well, the community structure has so totally changed.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot more integration between the men's community and the women's community. And part of that started in the early to mid 80s with the AIDS crisis. And for example, here in Columbus, when gay men were, I think it was in 84, maybe 83, gay men were told by the Red Cross that they were not allowed to donate blood.
It's still like that, isn't it?
Yes, it is. But they needed blood for research, to try and get a handle on what this devastation was being caused by. Because, they had no answers at the time. They didn't even have a test at the time. So my partner and I put a group together called Blood Sisters. And we had blood drives down at the YWCA. And we threw big parties. And we did not charge anyone to come to these parties, except that they donate blood. Mm-hmm. So we would have the blood drive. And
that's a good idea.
Yeah. And so that, that kind of thing was happening all around the country, where in women's communities we were watching our gay male friends being denied access purely because they were gay. Mm-hmm. And we were watching them die. And that really had an impact on how gay men and lesbians started interacting and started working together politically.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
Never thought about that.
I mean, not just here in Columbus, but everywhere.
Everywhere?
Yeah.
Would you say, as far as the activism you've done, are you optimistic? Do you see things getting better kind of every year type of thing, or? Well,
I take a much longer view. I mean, because, I'm 56 years old and I've been doing this for a long time. Mm-hmm. And I think back to, 1984. And then I think about how it is now, and hell yeah, it's different. Mm-hmm. And hell yeah, it's a lot better. We've got a city council meeting next Monday where council is changing the city code to be inclusive of transgender now. We've been fighting for that since 1989. But we finally got it done. So
it's my entire lifetime.
So, well, and I'm an optimist. Mm-hmm. I joke and say I was Pollyanna in a former life. But if you take the long view like that, you can really see how far things have progressed. And it helps to keep in mind that, nothing happens quickly, really. Change does not happen quickly. Mm-hmm. And it has to be organized. We can't just complain. We have to, kick butt and take names,
Yeah.
And call people on the carpet when they don't do what they should be doing, mm-hmm. when they're not doing the right thing.
What would you say the most important moment in Columbus GLBT history is, if you can narrow it down?
Well, there's been quite a few, but one that really had a galvanizing effect and impact on the queer community here was in 1989. City Council was debating protection laws and non-discrimination law that included lesbians and gays. And there's actually a documentary that I have at home that a community member made of that city council proceeding. And the radical right, although it was not known as that in those days, bussed people in from all over the state to come to our city council meeting and protest. And it was one of the most frightening evenings because, you're all packed in this room. And, with my experience having been in protests and riots and this and that, being packed into a room and not having access to the doorways to get away from it, it was... And we, Stonewall had a TV show at the time on public access TV. And we showed that documentary, obviously, because of what happened that night with all these church buses coming in. The city council lost their courage and didn't pass it. And we felt betrayed because we had been promised votes. And we were angry. And we realized that we had to do a heck of a lot more work and stop being quite so trusting of the powers that be until we could get ourselves into the powers.
Yeah.
So I think that really had an impact, particularly on political activism in Columbus, that people decided that we needed to be a little more sophisticated and get ourselves into positions of power and get ourselves aligned with folks who had the power. And we're still doing that.
That's great. You said Stonewall had a television channel?
A show on Channel 21, which, gosh, they went out of business about 10 years ago. The TV station did. But it was community television. Anybody could go and have a show. And there were some pretty bizarre shows.
I bet.
But for 15 years, Stonewall had a weekly television show. It was on at like 11:30 at night and then replayed on Saturday. But that gave the community the ability to see what was going on, and broadcasting that documentary over and over and over to show people like what a debacle it was.
Yeah.
It got a lot more people interested in being politically active, even if it was checkbook activism, to help so that other people could, affect some change.
And finally, this is maybe a silly question, but how do you feel about the quote-unquote new generation
Well, I have
of
two
lesbians?
kids.
Yeah, no, I mean, like,
you know what?
working
And again,
with you guys and things like that.
probably because of my early training in sociology and social movement theory and organizational theory, because social movements are really organizations. No matter what concept you're talking about, youth need to feel ownership of what they're doing and not just do it the way their parents, and effectively we are their parents, in a community sense.
Yeah.
And so of course they're not going to think that we know what we're talking about. And they're going to have to do it on their own. But hopefully we've made it a little safer for them to do that. And hopefully, they will continue that forward momentum. We have to have faith that they're going to do it because we're getting tired. We're getting old.